Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. This is you and peace out to the rest of you. It is the blackest hearted, blackest mind, the blackest man on social media, sign of black in and shine. And again, asking you to hit the share button because the message is more important than the messenger. Years ago, I didn't think I was going to marry a woman from any part of East Africa. And I knew nothing about, especially Somalia, because I knew nothing about them to even think that would happen. I knew there was a Somalia. Right after I heard that it even existed, I heard that they were in a war. No Somalis lived in my hometown. I only saw them in Atlanta, and even then I didn't bother them because I knew that Muslim women weren't to be bothered and they shouldn't bother me either. So as early as 1995, my first hour of class in college, my first day, my first morning, my first class, I was already convinced that other people of color didn't respect us. And so later I heard that East Africans in general didn't like other Africans, and I didn't know how true it was. It would have fit the overarching pattern that I was beginning to understand, which was that the most West African looking or most Central African looking Negroes were the most discriminated against. But I wasn't really sure that this would have been the case, because had that been the case, how would Haile Selassie have been worshipped by Jamaicans who, like us, hailed from West Africa? So when I finally met Ethiopians in 96 and mostly 97, I learned that many of them actually had cultural issues with us, but they weren't racial issues because they knew they were black. Abyssinia and Ethiopia were names related to their blackness, just as Sudan means land of the blacks. So I understood that many rumors of other black people hating us must not be true anymore. But many rumors of other people of color looking down on us were true. I learned this quickly. I also found out that one of the things that tends to happen is that many Muslims tend to assume that Christians look up to white folks, and many Christians tend to assume that Muslims look up to Arabs. This is an assumption made by both of us that oftentimes leads to this disunity. Years later, I began to read on the internet that many black people geographically and ideologically close to, meaning they were Muslim, ideologically close to Arabs, were against other black people. But see, like I said, I read on the internet. And I knew that Ethiopians in general weren't this way, so I figured, okay, maybe they were talking about Tanzanians, Zanzibaris, maybe Somalis, I don't know. Who are they talking about? And years later, I learned about Islam, and I was convinced, and I accepted it. And only then did I really begin to meet Somalis, and I didn't see two things overall. I didn't see them hanging around Arabs trying to kiss up. I didn't see them hanging around Arabs at all, really. And I didn't see them dissing other black folks at all. So if they had cultural issues with someone, they would still be actually very nice to other people and limit their hostilities, ironically, to each other. And they admitted this. So this told me that what other people had told me must not be true. If you discussed it with them, they would say to you, we don't have issues with other people, it's with each other. I was still more loyal to the West Africans, and by extension West African Muslims especially, but I learned that there wasn't really a conflict of loyalties to begin with in these cases. So this idea that a few African Americans had that East Africans would look down on us because we were West African was an exaggerated idea. Many wouldn't think of it because they couldn't always guarantee that a West African was West African just by looks alone. You see, there is actually a lot of phenotypical overlap, and a lot of people are not aware of this. Not only is the East African phenotype not a white or an Arab phenotype, but it is East African, from which the Arabs, later the whites, got their phenotype. But in addition to that, the East and West African phenotypes generally have a lot of overlap. And the other thing, too, is that now DNA studies have shown that most people in either population have DNA from the other population. So to know that somebody is West African with certainty or East African, you have to ask, hear the language, and check out the clothing. Ask them to try, things like that. Looks, they do help you, but they do not guarantee. And to be honest, they shouldn't. Now that we got that out the way, let me clear up this whole question of the Bantu Jarir discrimination by Somalis against the Somali Bantu, or as they're called, the Jarir. First off, to really give you a background, the word Jarir simply means the same thing as 4C hair. Jarir is the description, Timo is the noun hair. It means coarse or nappy, and the word isn't even used by itself in the north. because in the North, they don't come across what we call the Jarir people. So when they hear the word Jarir, they're thinking strictly of a hair texture. And that's really something that barbers or hairdressers have to use more often. Northerners don't come across Somali Bantu, so they don't have a feeling one way or another because they don't meet them. They're Northerners that never know what a Somali Bantu is. In the South, they meet them, and this is where the issues lied. But the discrimination was worse than it is now, and many youngsters I know are against this discrimination. Yesterday, I learned that many of the elders are against it. Their attitudes about marriage may differ, but many of them even now are becoming more lax about their kids marrying anyone who's Muslim, which is the Muslim attitude to have ideally. Ideally, I likewise should have no issues with my daughters marrying non-black men if they're Muslim, but the world's not ideal, and my prohibition is based on practical real threats, but that's another recording. So Somali Bantus or Jarir aren't usually targeted for mistreatment, but rather any smaller tribe is at risk, including the Somali Bantu, and the risks are now decreasing by the month because Somalis at home and abroad are getting sick and tired of the tribalism. And I tip my hat off to them. Because unlike other tribal people, they're actually learning their lessons. Now, some of you may want me to say that the only Jarir people, or only really the Jarir people are discriminated against based on looks, but that's not true either. You see, the issue that Somalis have with looks is not a different issue that we have. It's the exact same issue we have with looks. We make fun of everything. So do they. So if they will joke within the same family about shade, hair texture, height, shortness, build, they will do it and then we will do it. How are we really that different? They'll joke about light skin or dark skin. They'll joke about straight or coarse hair, which, as I said, is called Tim or Jarir in their language. They will even joke about deformities resulting from an accident that someone suffered. It's nothing to hear somebody say, go tell burnt feet that dinner is ready. If someone's feet got burned in an accident, that's going to be his nickname, burnt feet. I would have been named Bidarle, which means bald, but I chose that as a nickname, so consequently they don't use it to make fun. If I hadn't, they would have done it. Not out of hatred, but if somebody got angry, then he would have done it for real. The issue is not that Somalis are so different from us, really. The issue is that they're so much like us. And by us, I mean Africans from West Africa and including the diaspora. You think Usain Bolt never got teased growing up in Jamaica? His speed was not always a compliment. Because you know how we black folk are. And in Jamaica, that doesn't change. What do they say? He runs fast because he knows he can't fight. I'm sure somebody would have said that. Now, I don't think he can't fight. He probably can. But I bet you that he heard that coming up. You think that a Liberian who is light-skinned or jet black would not hear jokes about it? The Loma are a jet black tribe, and they'll make jokes about it sometimes, especially when they move away from Lofa County and go into the coastline areas. No, we as a race have never spared anyone within our race, and Somali Bantus do catch it because they aren't the majority, and they were viewed as slaves, to be honest, and yes, there is hypocrisy in the Somali culture. But the Somali Bantu are not necessarily at the bottom of the totem pole, from my understanding, because any minority population is. My own wife and her sisters told me that this happens and that the Somali culture has its hypocrisies. So I'm not here to defend their culture where the customs are wrong. I'm here to tell you that the good and bad in their culture is very parallel to the good and bad in ours. And when I say ours, I mean our cultures, since we also have diversity, but we got hypocrisy in our cultures. They do not hold on to Islam for many generations once they leave Somalia. We're starting to see that trend now. That's just like us. Those of us that were Muslim, you give us about 2 generations here, and Islam is gone. Now, they do now, but they did not look at others as their equals, even from other tribes, not just other ethnicities altogether. There was a time they weren't necessarily mean to everybody, but they just didn't see anybody as their equals. Now they're beginning to look and see other people as their equals. They fought each other like lions, and they fought the Pakistani peacekeepers that were stationed there, who initially would not shoot them because they were Muslim. But Somalis themselves will admit that the Pakistani peacekeepers stationed there were fired upon first by Somalis, then they began to fire back. It wasn't every Somali shooting at them. I'm simply saying that the ones involved in shooting each other did in fact shoot the Pakistani peacekeepers first. And Somalis admit to that. Only then did the Pakistani, they were UN Pakistani forces. Only then did they fire on them afterwards. In the meantime, they were fighting each other based on tribal things we can't even understand. They actually fought. And these tribes are related to each other. Same religion, same language. They actually fought more than unrelated tribes in West Africa have fought in decades and in some regions even centuries. I mean, even Liberia didn't have a whole lot of tribal warfare. The Civil War quickly became non-tribal and very political and based on greed. The tribalism in Somalia is recently being discarded because of war fatigue and trauma. And frankly, many elders in the U.S. told me they're not going to teach their kids which tribe they're from because the society can no longer handle that. They don't want their kids to be tribal, and hats off to them for learning that lesson too. They're better than the Gulf Arabs in that regard. The Gulf Arabs, you just had to find oil and make everybody rich to get them to stop fighting over goats and camels that didn't even have any names. And this leads to my next point. Somalis don't look up to Arabs in general. They have never felt that Arabs were their equals, and they never accepted Islam as an Arab thing. This is another similarity they have with other Africans who accepted Islam. Yeah, people don't realize that most Africans, when they accepted Islam, especially even in the Sahara, even when the Berbers accepted it, they did it in spite of the Arabs, not because of conquest. When they were conquered, they accepted it a hell of a lot less than when some people simply began to preach it to them. This is another secret, but that's another recording too. So they have this similarity with other Africans that accepted Islam and with Malaysians and Indonesians who accepted Islam before there was ever such a place as Malaysia or Indonesia, back when it was all Malaya. There was no conquest, there was no Arab superiority, and there was no African or Malay inferiority complex. Initially, Africans and Malay people, ironically, when they meet, they tend to get along fine so long as the African doesn't behave like a Nigerian from Lagos. They tend to get along fine. So if a group of people are not our enemies, it would be them. And what do they have in common with us? They can accept Islam without being conquered. And they weren't going to be conquered. And ironically, Africans, including Somalis and Malay people, have issues with Arabs. I wonder why. But getting back to Somalis never thought of Arabs as even being their equals. They used to donate camels to the Arabian Peninsula before they found oil. And they did this with pity, not to kiss up to the Arabs. They said, oh my God, look, they don't have anything except wind and dust and a few camels. They need more camels. So they would donate it. Now, many of the men refused Emirati citizenship back in the 1970s. They would say, well, we're Muslim brothers, but I'd never take your passport and citizenship. I'm Somali. They didn't care about the oil wealth that the Emirates were beginning to develop back then. They would refuse jobs as security guards, and they had no qualifications for other work that would pay more, but because they were proud, they wouldn't take jobs as security guards. That's how they were. Now, the youth have told me that the elders used to be arrogant like this. Not hateful, just arrogant. It appears that as Allah has humbled them with each other, they've learned the lesson, and the arrogance, fortunately, is a dying trend. But now they're dealing with trauma and nightmares and night sweats and interrupted sleep patterns, as are the rest of us, because they got traumatized by the Brits and the Italians who colonized them, and then they got traumatized by each other after independence. After they had some time as the strongest economy on the continent, they still traumatized each other. So we're going through trauma and they're going through trauma. And the Somali Bantu are also going through trauma. So they have every right to be pissed. Don't get me wrong. Because you see, the discrimination that they did experience along with all the other minority tribes like the Midgan, who aren't Bantu and who are also Hamitic like the other tribes and who are famous for even good looks were kept aside, it's still fresh in their minds. The Midgan and the Bantu, they still have every right to be pissed off and even traumatized. We should not say to them, get over it on the opposite end of the spectrum. And I'm not going to tell them that. The thing is that most Somalis now were against them being mistreated. And therefore, they're not the threats to other people that they're not the threat to black people that some of our illiterate, pro-whack, easily misled ninjas assume that they are simply because they have a different phenotype. That's not the case either. See, when an aggressor stops and comes to his senses and quits the aggression, there's still time needed for the victim to de-traumatize And they're not going to trust the former aggressor right off the bat. And I think that the Bantu and the Midgan have every right to go through this stage. They got to. And they should be well armed. I think they should run the country, to be honest. But again, maybe I'm biased because I'm also from the same lineage as the Bauntu, which really just means that I'm not Semitic or Hamitic, to be honest. And, the term Bantu can be problematic because while Africans do have a concept of the Bauntu, the people of an ancestor named Untu, even though there is that, I understand that the contraction Bantu was coined by a booty banded professor out of California. And I'm not going to let non-blacks, especially booty bandits, define us like that. Yeah, I said it. It's not that I hate them per se. It's just that they don't get to define us. They got their community and they have power and they're not going through what we're going through. So no, with no hatred, you don't get to define us. Anyway, that's also another recording. The issue here is that the Midgan and the Bantu have a right to be pissed and distrustful. They don't need us to go beating up on Somalis for them, but they do have a right to distrust them now and even refuse to sympathize with them when someone else discriminates against them. But this leads to my last point. Non-blacks do not discriminate against us because of anything to do with tribe or ethnicity within our race. When they do it, it is not because of some diversity. It is because we're black. That's it. Other people act almost uniformly with us with a few exceptions because of our blackness. They do it even when some of their own people look black to them. So for this reason, I remind us that even though I try to set records straight, I'm not justifying a damn thing that we've done to each other. And I remind us that even though we are diverse and we're not going to always agree or love each other, we do have a practical reason to be unified around. And that practical reason is self-defense, because we do share a uniform that others have agreed to target, and none of us are immune. That's all I'm getting at. Appreciate y'all listening. Black heart, black mind, blackout. Assalamu alaikum.